economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war.
If you do not understand racism, which is white supremacy, what it is and how it works, everything else that you understand will only confuse you. Confuse you. Confuse you. Confuse you. Confuse you. If you do not understand, confuse you. If you do not understand, confuse you. If you do not understand, confuse you. Confuse you.
My definition of white supremacy and racism, I use those two terms as synonyms. I use the same definition for both terms. That definition is as follows: a global system of people who classify themselves as white and are dedicated to abusing and or subjugating everyone in the known universe whom they classify as not white.
Economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war.
What you're about to see is a matter of human record. Explain it? We cannot. Disprove it? We cannot. We simply invite you to explore with us the amazing world of the unknown, to take that one step beyond. What you're about to see is a matter of human record. Explain it? We cannot. Disprove it? We cannot. We simply invite you to explore with us the amazing world of the unknown, to take that one step beyond.
Dr. Smith, it's called Ward 7.
You mind taking the next car, please?
It's called Ward 7.
You're late.
I know.
I've been looking for you.
Still on prison ward, Lefty. Up.
Henry will take you back up.
Why, Henry?
He's taking over from me. I ain't riding no elevator tonight.
Why?
Trouble's coming over from Beaver Canal, and I'm gonna get me some.
What are you talking about?
Jonah just told me. One of the janitors picked it up from Joe the barber. He flops in the mission over there because he passes for white. He heard him talk.
About what?
About you and what they're gonna do to Nigger Town tonight because you killed Johnny Biddle.
You've got to stop them, Lefty.
Stop who? Beaver Canal?
It won't help. It never has. It only makes it worse.
Not for us, it won't. Not tonight. We're gonna be ready tonight.
You're talking like a crazy man.
Yes, sometimes I do get a little crazy when these things happen. Like 6 years ago when Beaver Canal came over. You were in school. My kid sister's still in a wheelchair. I got this from a broken bottle.
They're waiting for you outside.
Thanks, Henry.
Lefty. But don't you see, this way you're no better than they are.
Ain't that asking a lot for us to be better than them when we get killed just trying to prove we're as good.
Every day, millions of messages invade our screens. Their aim? To direct our choices in purchasing, voting, or adhering to an idea. They are omnipresent and shape our vision of the world. They rely on persuasion techniques invented a century ago in the United States. They were developed in less than 50 years by a small group of thinkers in order to control the masses. To impose their power, authoritarian regimes used force. Western democracies invented public relations. One of the group's leading theoreticians was Edward Bernays.
Public relations embraces what I call the engineering of consent, based on Thomas Jefferson's principle that in a democratic society, everything depends on the consent of the people.
In 40 years, Edward Bernays succeeded in turning a concept of people governance into a reality firmly rooted in all spheres of society. In 1990, 5 years before his death, Life magazine named Edward Bernays as one of the most influential Americans of the 20th century.
But don't you see, this way you're no better than they are.
Ain't that asking a lot for us to be better than them when we get killed just trying to prove we're as good.
Beep, beep, beep.
Propaganda. Many use the word when talking about countries like North Korea, Kazakhstan, Iran. Countries viewed as authoritarian through the lens of the Western media. Press freedom, freedom of thought. People use those terms when talking about countries like the United States, France, Australia, democracies. In 1988, Noam Chomsky co-authored a book with Edward Herman called Manufacturing Consent. It blasted apart the notion that media acts as a check on political power, that media inform the public, serve the public, so that we can better engage in the political process. In fact, media manufacture our consent. They tell us what those in power need them to tell us so we can fall in line. Democracy is staged with the help of media that work as propaganda machines. Media operate through 5 filters. The first has to do with ownership. Mass media firms are big corporations. Often they're part of even bigger conglomerates. Their end game, profit. And so it's in their interests to push for whatever guarantees that profit. Critical journalism takes second place to the needs and interests of the corporation. The second filter exposes the real role of advertising. Media costs a lot more than consumers will ever pay. So who fills the gap? Advertisers. And what are the advertisers paying for? Audiences. And so it isn't so much that the media are selling you a product, their output. They're also selling advertisers a product, you. How does the establishment manage the media? That's the third filter. Journalism cannot be a check on power because the very system encourages complicity. Governments, corporations, big institutions know how to play the media game. They know how to influence the news narrative. They feed media scoops, official accounts, interviews with the experts. They make themselves crucial to the process of journalism. So those in power and those who report on them are in bed with each other. If you want to challenge power, you'll be pushed to the margins. Your name won't be down. You won't be getting in. You've lost your access. You've lost the story. When the media, journalists, whistleblowers, sources, stray away from the consensus, they get flat. That's the fourth filter. When the story is inconvenient for the powers that be, you'll see the flak machine in action, discrediting sources, trashing stories, and diverting the conversation. To manufacture consent, you need an enemy, a target. That common enemy is the fifth filter. Communism, terrorists, immigrants, a common enemy. A boogeyman to fear helps corral public opinion. 5 filters, one big media theory. Consent is being manufactured all around you, all the time. Huh?
Don't you see, this way you're no better than they are.
Ain't that asking a lot for us to be better than them when we get killed just trying to prove we're as good.
My name is Harriet Washington. I'm a writer, medical ethicist. I wrote a book entitled Medical Apartheid, which was the first comprehensive social history of research with African Americans. And it dealt with not only history of medicine, but also with social ills, racism. And a lot of my work has also focused on the intersection of ethics, history, and race in this country as it pertains to medical practices. It's a special interest of mine. I also do some teaching. I teach a bioethics course at Columbia University and lecture widely in this country and abroad about medical ethics issues, everything from conspiracy theories to the erosion of informed consent. And I find a great deal to keep me occupied.
But don't you see, this way you're no better than they are.
Ain't that asking a lot for us to be better than them when we get killed just trying to prove we're as good.
The work on race, addressing racism and bias in medical education, I think started when the course directors of our Art and Science of Medicine course, that's our first year doctoring course, Dr. Joseph Trulio and Joanne Hoysack, who are the course directors of the Art and Science of Medicine course 1 and 2, began to reevaluate the teaching approach that we had in place that would basically allow students to develop a fictitious patient profile of a patient living with a specific chronic condition such as diabetes, hypertension, COPD, and so on.
We spent obviously a lot of time in class, and in class you're always hearing about they're more likely to have poor kidney function, or they're more likely to have heart disease, or they're more likely to have diabetes. We got to the ASM course, which is our doctoring course, and again, there was commentary on like social determinants of health. You know, people from East Harlem are more likely to have diabetes because they don't have access to food, you know, healthy foods, or they're more likely to have poorly controlled hypertension because they're less likely to see a doctor. But all of these things were sort of decontextualized, depoliticized, and it made it seem like the burden was the patient's fault, right? And we found that to be problematic and incomplete.
We were actually priming our students to utilize and overutilize stereotypes, which then led to a priming effect of actually engaging in judgments and interpretations and making associations based on people's demographic profile with a chronic condition, which quite frankly led to racializing chronic conditions and the ways in which people were living with and managing their health.
Within the medical school, we were also noticing that there were some problematic practices that were occurring between the administration and students of color. And so we basically saw that those two things were kind of linked, right? It's not coincident. It's not a coincidence that you have these kinds of conversations occurring in the classroom, and at the same time, the administration doesn't necessarily know how to handle students of color, particularly underrepresented minorities. So we basically organized as a student group under the Anti-Racism Coalition, which was a coalition of students from SEOM, LMSA, Doctors for America. Basically a whole bunch of student groups came together and said, we need to talk about curriculum, we need to talk about what's going on in the clinical setting, and we need to talk about our relationship with the administration. That group then created a formal presentation that we ended up taking to MedEd and to Dr. Cherney.
Once these issues were brought to the attention of leadership took a stand and committed to addressing these issues throughout the entire medical school in a variety of ways. One was really working closely with the students that comprised of the Anti-Racism Coalition, led by Giselle and others, and sitting down and having a conversation about, like, how did this get to be the way it is? And what is it that we can undo in terms of how we are creating this learning environment for our medical students?
We definitely realized that before we were coming with a specific vocabulary that the school hadn't really heard of before, right? They had never really heard of anti-racism. We've talked about bias, we've talked about diversity, we've talked about prejudice, maybe even dabbled in the concept of racism, but we really never talked about anti-racism. And so it was a lot of sort of onboarding in terms of teaching language before we could actually get to changing anything. So it was a lot of teaching, not in a way that's sort of, condescending, but in a way that allows for collaboration. When it came time to creating a new curriculum, we were on the same page.
When they formed themselves as the Anti-Racism Coalition, that was a new term for us in medical education. I was like, what do you mean by anti-racism? And they introduced this whole pedagogy and the language and the vocabulary and the terms and the literature and the knowledge, and were educating us while also asking us to take a stand, right? So we were learning and doing at the same time as a leadership team. And that meant that we had to be honest with what we knew and what we didn't know, and that we didn't know it all in medicine. We had to build the capacity of our faculty to engage in these issues, right? Physicians are not trained to facilitate conversations about systems of oppression. They're not trained to facilitate conversations about racism and sexism and the ways in which structural biases play out in medicine and healthcare. And we had to build out their capacity, and that's something we're continually working on, not only in enabling them and equipping them with the skills, the knowledge, and vocabulary, but also having them reflect on their own biases as an educator. Immediately, Joe Trulio, who's the ASM co-course director, and I partnered with many students of color to think through how could we begin to develop curricular, not only modules, but an integrative focus throughout all 4 years of medical school, beginning with the biggest course, the Art and Science of Medicine course, right? The doctoring course. So we would dive deeper into these issues and bring it into the formal curriculum of our In Focus weeks, which are these weeks where there's no formal class, but it's a deep dive into other topic areas that are not necessarily formally addressed in the traditional medical education curriculum, such as health disparities and research and global health and law and science and medicine. And we began to make sure that the ways in which the topics were being addressed were also being addressed through this lens of racism and bias, so that it wasn't seen as a separate, now we're going to talk about racism and bias, but that we're going to talk about the ethics of consent to research through the lens of racism, through the lens of justice. We have built out additional curriculum that is replaced existing curriculum so that it is more integrative, and that we are stacking it each year by each year so that a student hears from day one in orientation from Dr. Mahler, this is the school that you're at, this is we explicitly address and name racism in medicine. We explicitly deal with these issues, and we're working and committed to creating the learning space for you to be challenged by it, to grow, to contribute, and to transform into a physician that really is our mission, right? To be a catalyst for change.
Really interested in what it means to grow leaders, particularly student leaders who come from underrepresented backgrounds. We're hoping to grow a group of students who can go on to become teachers in the future and can go on to continue these conversations moving forward.
Don't you see, this way you're no better than they are. Ain't that asking a lot for us to be better than them when we get killed just trying to prove we're as good?
I was very happy to be invited back to EVMS. I lecture at many medical schools and institutions across the country, but this one always stayed in my mind. I had especially warm memories of it, and I find it a really exciting place because of the progress and the focus on issues of medicine and medical practice and medical care that go beyond the clinical classwork and the clinical issues. The issues are embedded in our society, and they dramatically affect how people's health waxes and wanes. And this is a school, an institution that has always taken this to heart, has always understood that one can't treat people in isolation in a clinic or in a hospital bed, that the entire person has to be addressed, and that means addressing some unfortunate aspects of our society. And anyway, it's always had a special place in my heart, and I'm very happy to be back here.
But don't you see, this way you're no better than they are.
Ain't that asking a lot for us to be better than them when we get killed just trying to prove we're as good?
For many of us who are in the oppressed class or whatever, I don't even use those kind of words to describe people, because I just feel like, at some point we have to get to a point of truth and reckoning about who we are and make our way regardless, right? But for you, this exploration was about what? What conclusion did you want people to come to after reading your works?
Well, in other words, it's absolutely critical that black people understand the dominant power dynamic on the planet that impacts their lives 24/7 times 365 times the length of time they've been on the planet. So this is the dominant, for example, the very fact that we are talking, this is October the 13th, 2014, the fact that we're talking about racism, the fact that we're talking about something that I wrote about racism speaks to the dominance of racism, and there's no way of escaping it. For example, all of the issues that are in Ferguson are related to racism, white supremacy, black males being killed by white males with guns.
Yeah, chapter 15, the symbolism, logic, and meaning of justifiable homicide in the 1980s. This book, by the way, was written in the 1980s. So what you're saying to me is even more poignant. As I was rereading this chapter 15 last night, I'm like, wait a minute, this is still going on, and you break down how this system of justifiable homicide as it relates to police officers and black males in particular in the society came about. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because Ferguson today, they had a march yesterday, actually this weekend, and I'm going to talk about that later on in the show. But yeah, that's a hotbed right now. That topic is, and everyone thinks it's new, but it's not.
See, it's not new. It's not new at all. In other words, aspects, the dynamic of racism, white supremacy has been black people's experience for the last 500 years. And black people have operated in a system of praying and hoping that tomorrow it will be gone. Or if certain legislation is passed, it'll be gone. Just like our ancestors who were enslaved. They thought, well, if they take off the chains, our problems will be solved. But the chains were replaced with laws, and the laws were changed, and black people thought, well, everything is fine. We got a black president. Everything is fine. And now we find ourselves in really one of the most desperate situations, local, national, global, because we have right now thousands of black people being impacted by Ebola on the continent of Africa. Those people in the west coast of Africa, those are our ancestors.
So what can we do?
Well, do you see, Neely Fuller, who is the person that helped me understand racism, white supremacy as a system, he says this: if you do not understand white supremacy, racism, what it is and how it works, everything else that you understand will only confuse you. Do you see? In other words, it's no different than saying, if you're on a football field and you don't understand what the game of football is about, then you're completely confused. You'll be twirling around in a circle, not knowing what to do with your behavior.
So what should we do? Because at the end of the day...
Well, do you see, I've just stated.
Knowledge is power.
People have to understand exactly and specifically what racism, white supremacy is. And I say it's a power system dynamic structured and maintained by persons who classify themselves as white, whether consciously or subconsciously determined, which consists of patterns of perception, logic, symbol formation, thought, speech, action, and emotional response as conducted simultaneously in all areas of people activity, economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war, for the ultimate purpose of white genetic survival and preventing white genetic annihilation on planet Earth.
Okay, and once we understand that, okay, all right.
It's planet upon which the vast and overwhelming majority of people are classified as non-white by white-skinned people, and all of them are genetically dominant in terms of skin coloration compared to genetic recessive white-skinned people. Do you see? So just understanding, in other words, I don't talk about white people hating black people or people of color. No, people who classify themselves as white on planet Earth are embarked on a system of behavior that permits them to not be genetically annihilated.
Which is the first law of man, right? Survival. Right? Everybody wants to survive, right?
But it's like, as long as you don't understand specifically what people are doing, you're confused.
I got you. So once we understand that this is what we're in, what do we do with this to prevent the next Michael Brown or the next Trayvon Martin or the next Eric Garner?
See, in other words, once you understand what fire is, you don't go around asking people, if fire breaks out in your home, what do I do? Because you understand fire. You don't stand in your house looking at a fire and telling yourself it's a bunch of a rose bush growing in the corner. If it's fire because you understand fire in depth, then you know what to do. Fire is one of the first things that parents have to help children understand. So once your brain understands something, this is why black people go around asking each other, hey, what's happening? What's happening? What's happening? Hey, what's happening? Because we don't know what's going on. We have been deceived. When somebody tells you you're in a system of democracy and everybody is equal and everybody has equal opportunity. But that's not true. We're in a system of racism, white supremacy. And what makes black people have high blood pressure, stroke, kidney disease, diabetes, dying prematurely, obesity, all of these are illnesses specifically related to the hammering of 24/7 stress. Racism, white supremacy is 24/7 stress on black people. There's a black man just in my office talking about the employment stress as people try to prevent a highly educated, well-trained black male from advancing in a job situation. Look at what is happening to President Obama.
So when you see patients in your psychiatry practice in D.C., which is where you have your office, right? And people come in, how do you treat them? I mean, do you prescribe something? Like, what are some of the ways that folks can deal with the everyday stresses that they're dealing with?
No, you ask a person who comes into a psychiatrist's office, like, what is their chief complaint, or how is it that I may help you? What is the problem? So people come to the doctor with a problem. My answer is not, let me get out my prescription pad. My response is, let me listen to you. Let me hear the history of your complaint. And with a black person, it's always some aspect of racism, because racism is the highest form of terrorism and violence on the planet.
Do you have white patients?
I've had white patients. I have a few white patients at this point.
Do you treat them based on your belief system rooted in this white supremacy.
See, in other words, people have to be treated in psychiatry. Everything has to do with reality, and people, whether or not they are in touch with reality. And black people are forced into distortions of reality because they're forced into, in a significant degree, to deny racism. In other words, you will get in trouble with people who classify themselves as white if you talk about racism.
Okay, I'm going to do that today. I'm going to do that because you just said
You're
that.
going to do what?
I'm going to talk about it. I'm going to talk
Well,
about it.
this is very important.
No, I'm going to talk about it.
We
We're going to talk about
got to go back to the first black attorney general appointed under the first black president. In my book, Eric Holder is the hero of the day because he dared to say, are we a nation of cowards?
And he had to leave office under what we know.
Being unable to talk about racism. Do you see? But in other words, he is fundamentally saying, being unable to talk about reality, the country is headed towards disaster.
Okay. And I'm going to put that question out to our listeners because I'm curious, and I'm so grateful for you doing all of the work that you're doing. And folks, if you're in the DC area and you need a psychiatrist, Dr. Francis Cress Welsing is the one you should go see. The ISIS Papers is still in circulation. I just ordered another copy. I may give it away at some point on the air as well. The Keys to the Colors. Thank you so much for joining us and dropping that bit of knowledge on us today. Thank you so much, Dr. Welsing.
Thank you.
Okay.
But don't you see, this way you're no better than they are. Ain't that asking a lot for us to be better than them when we get killed just trying to prove we're as good?
We're in a system of racism, white supremacy. And what makes black people have high blood pressure, stroke, kidney disease, diabetes, dying prematurely, obesity, all of these are illnesses specifically related to the hammering of 24/7 stress. Racism, white supremacy is 24/7 stress on black people.
It's hard to know what first piqued my interest in looking at the history of ethics as it pertained to African Americans and their treatment by the medical institutions in this country. But I know that my initial desire to be a physician and working in hospitals for over 10 years certainly sharpened that interest. I saw many things that troubled me and disturbed me, many questions I had about the interactions between individual patients and clinicians. And I actually found that clinicians were often very open about discussing with me their own trepidation about the way they felt constrained to treat patients. But it was a really interesting experience I had that I recount in Medical Apartheid when I was running a poison control center in a hospital in upstate New York. We were allowed to have extra space that was ceded to us by radiology. And I also found an old file cabinet that I knew I could use at my office. So I'm opening this file cabinet, cleaning it out, and I found all these old filed folders of patients that had been forgotten. And being who I am, I read every last one of them, of course. And I was struck by the fact that these were patients who were being considered for kidney transplantation. But their files looked different, and the differences seemed to be assorted according to race. The files of the black patients were very thin, and those of the white patients were fatter. It's because the ones of the white patients had reams and reams of documentation about their social history, positive. They had positive support from family and friends about their insurance that made them able to pay for this kind of procedure, and bolstering their claim, for a new kidney, called the social profile. The social profiles of the other patients, the black ones, everyone had the word Negro stamped on it, and they were thinner. Although, in particular, I saw one file that were a gentleman who had insurance, had a loving family like the other patients, and yet the plan for this patient was not to help him find an organ, but to help him prepare for his imminent demise. And I thought, is it race that's separating these patients from a kidney that they need to live? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. but it certainly looked suspicious, and I had to know more. I think that triggered my interest. After that, I began looking everywhere to see whether or not black and white patients were being treated equally with the same access to life-saving technologies. And dismayingly often, I saw that they were not. I wasn't a writer then. That's the interesting thing. I was running a poison control center, but when I became a writer, I knew it would be the first book that I felt passionately about, and it was.
But don't you see, this way you're no better than they are.
Ain't that asking a lot for us to be better than them when we get killed just trying to prove we're as good?
We're in a system of racism, white supremacy. And what makes black people have high blood pressure, stroke, kidney disease, diabetes, dying prematurely, obesity, all of these are illnesses specifically related to the hammering of 24/7 stress. Racism, white supremacy is 24/7 stress on black people.
The future of humanity is increasingly African. That's the summary of a report released this week by UNICEF, and the numbers are stunning. By the end of the century, forecasts show that nearly 40% of the world's people will be African. That's up from about 15% now. Africa's population will soar to more than 4 billion by 2100, nearly 1 billion of those people in one country alone, Nigeria. David Anthony is the lead author of the UNICEF report. When we reached him, he was in Johannesburg, where they released the findings. He joined us from the airport. He said UNICEF follows these numbers regularly, but these new population projections stood out.
We were surprised. I mean, we had done a previous report and knew that the world's population was swinging towards Africa, but there have been new estimates released by the UN Population Division on which the report is based that shows an even stronger swing than we had anticipated.
When you look at these numbers, is there one that's the most striking to you that illustrates what's going on with this population boom in Africa, in particular when it comes to children?
Yeah, I think there are two figures. One is that almost 1.8 billion births are going to take place in Africa in the next 35 years on current trends. And the second one is that Africa will have almost 1 billion children by 2050. I think these are two facts that have been very sobering for us at UNICEF and have given us pause for thought and reflection, even in our own strategy towards Africa.
It's interesting, Mr. Anthony, because fertility rates in Africa, as I understand it, are declining, but they are still very, very high. What else is fueling this projected population explosion?
Well, the fertility rates are still high. I mean, every African woman on average has 4.5 children. The global average is 2.5. So there's a considerable disparity, but also just the sheer number of women of reproductive age, that's women ages 15 to 49, has grown enormously and is set to pretty much more than double in the next 35 years. So it's just, even though fertility rates are declining, the number of women having babies will increase so much that it will kind of offset and you'll have increasing numbers. Plus also mortality rates among children are improving in Africa, so it means that more births are surviving.
Would UNICEF also be taking the position that this population explosion is simply unsustainable and there would need to be changes made, perhaps reproductive health issues in Africa that you would want to see changes with?
I think the unsustainability issue is not really in play. I mean, I think Africa has a very low population density compared to many, many other regions. I think it has room to grow and develop. I think it's much more about how the transition is handled and how Africa invests in its future youth and people. That becomes its greatest policy challenge at the moment.
The report that you've issued today with UNICEF is called for courageous and determined action to deal with the challenges of this population boom in Africa. What action specifically would you want to see?
I think we want to see Africa's leaders take the the policy decisions, really both to proactively manage the demographic transition and to make the correct and right investments in children that are needed to build a skilled, dynamic African labor force that's productive and can grow and can add value to the economy. And I think those are the really crucial things: investing in girls, investing in children, investing in young people, linking education to employment, linking early child development to the whole cycle of development of the child and of young people. I think these are some of the investments that we really want to see very much in Africa, and we are very much supportive in the continent.
David Anthony, thanks for talking with us.
Thank you very much.
David Anthony is chief of the Policy Advisory Unit for UNICEF and lead author of a UNICEF report on population growth projections in Africa.
But don't you see, this way you're no better than they are. Ain't that asking a lot for us to be better than them when we get killed just trying to prove we're as good?
We're in a system of racism, white supremacy. And what makes black people have high blood pressure, stroke, kidney disease, diabetes, dying prematurely, obesity, all of these are illnesses specifically related to the hammering of 24/7 stress. Racism, white supremacy is 24/7 stress on black people.
After I had the opportunity to train in medical ethics, I spent 2.5 years training in medical ethics, and one of the questions I had was that there was one study, and seemingly only one study, that was acknowledged and well known among many people, in which African Americans were mistreated, and that was a Tuskegee study. But I had already learned from my own curiosity, my own research, that there had been many, many studies, many of them, in fact, most of them, much worse than Tuskegee. Studies in which African Americans were actively harmed, killed even, and I wondered why Tuskegee had such root in the American psyche, and I quickly realized it's because that's all people know about. Very often I would ask people about research with African Americans, clinical people, historians, people who should know, and they would only say Tuskegee. You're asking about Tuskegee, right? I'm like, no, I'm asking about everything else. I realized people did not know this history at all. And I went to international conference in Lübeck, Germany, of historians of medicine focused on medical experimentation in the 20th century. And they all said that only Tuskegee had harmed African Americans. I knew that wasn't true. So I began realizing the consequences of not understanding that there had been scores and scores of abusive medical research with African Americans over the decades. The consequences are that very often Tuskegee was dismissed as a terrible thing that happened, but it was accorded, the fears of African Americans to engage in medical research were accorded to Tuskegee. Well, they don't want to engage in medical research because they're overreacting to Tuskegee. It was called an overreaction to a single study, and I knew that wasn't true. I knew that people were actually reacting to centuries of abuse, and I thought it was really important to document that because nobody else had. When I went to the medical libraries in Europe and in the US, prestigious organizations like Harvard's Countway Library, you would find shelves filled with abuses toward whites and other groups, but nothing on the abuse of African Americans, nothing in books. But when I went to the basement and looked at the medical journals from the 18th, 19th century, I saw plenty there, but it was episodic. And I thought someone needs to pull this together so that people will understand that there's an entire canon of abusive research with African Americans. So people will stop dismissing it as a myth when these were actually all too real. And that's what I did.
But don't you see, this way you're no better than they are. Ain't that asking a lot for us to be better than them when we get killed just trying to prove we're as good?
We're in a system of racism, white supremacy. And what makes black people have high blood pressure, stroke, kidney disease, diabetes, dying prematurely, obesity, all of these are illnesses specifically related to the hammering of 24/7 stress. Racism, white supremacy is 24/7 stress on black people.
In American epidemics, race is a pre-existing condition, writes Soraya Nadia McDonald. Well, the coronavirus is no exception. So far from the Midwest to the Mid-Atlantic to the Mississippi Delta, the coronavirus has hit African Americans especially hard. 1/3 of the Americans hospitalized in March were black. That's despite being only 13% of the U.S. population. McDonald, who is culture critic for ESPN's The Undefeated, writes that while viruses don't discriminate, people do. And she goes back to the flu pandemic of 1918 to trace how systemic and long-standing this is. Soraya Nadia McDonald, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So describe what was happening in 1918. You write that African Americans were more likely to live in conditions where disease might spread, and then if they did get sick, less likely to get good medical care.
Exactly. So it should be understood overall that there wasn't necessarily great medical care for the flu, period. You know, the standard sort of treatment for the flu would be like lots of rest, lots of fluids, and staying away from other sick people.
Which sounds familiar.
Exactly, right? But like even within that framework, Black people during the 1918 flu pandemic are still at a disadvantage. And most of those reasons have to do with structural racism.
Yeah, I mean, give me the specific example of Chicago in 1918, which you write about.
This pandemic basically hits right before the U.S. is entering World War I, but also like right in the middle of the Great Migration. And so what that means is that you have Black folks who are coming up to Chicago from the South, who are basically fleeing sort of extraordinarily violent racism in the form of lynching, in the form of sexual violence, all of these things that are propelling Black people to move further north. And what happens is that they're not necessarily greeted with open arms. There's already this sort of alarmism even before the flu breaks out.
Just looking at the pictures that go with your article, I'm looking at the wards where they were being treated literally in basements.
Literally in basements, yes. So you can imagine, right? It's small, enclosed, not a whole lot of sunshine. They're often really dank. There's usually a moisture that we associate with basements. None of those things are ideal conditions if you're a sick person who has the flu. Even the flu itself sort of becomes pathologized, and Black people sort of get blamed for it, even though everyone is getting sick. So that, you see folks who are basically saying, oh, they're bringing this infection with them. And that is not necessarily, a view that could be considered outside of the mainstream, because you have a reporter for the Chicago Daily Tribune, as it was known at the time, who's writing these articles saying as much.
I mean, it resonates in so many painful ways today. I'm guessing many Asian Americans listening might feel the resonance of that, in the way that we have heard the current coronavirus being called the Wuhan virus or the China virus.
Exactly. So that goes sort of across class lines. That's the other thing that you see in sort of these parallels between 1918 and 2020 in terms of this sort of racialized scapegoating.
You sound sadly not shocked that we're seeing these numbers of African Americans that are out of whack with the general population.
Yeah, because these are sort of long-standing problems, right? We can still see the legacies, say, of redlining in Chicago. We can still see housing inequality in New York and all of these other cities across the country, where Black people basically flocked during this part of the 20th century. Detroit is another example. And so really, I think what we see is happening is just a magnified example of all of these inequalities that have basically pre-existed.
Soraya Nadia McDonald of ESPN's The Undefeated, talking there about her article headlined In 1918 and 2020, race colors America's response to epidemics. Soraya, thank you.
Thank you so much.
But don't you see, this way you're no better than they are. Ain't that asking a lot for us to be better than them when we get killed just trying to prove we're as good?
We're in a system of racism, white supremacy. And what makes black people have high blood pressure, stroke, kidney disease, diabetes, dying prematurely, obesity, all of these are illnesses specifically related to the hammering of 24/7 stress. Racism, white supremacy is 24/7 stress on black people.
You know, it would have been good if I could have said the book ended with Tuskegee, that we had learned everything that we should have learned, but we didn't at all. So what's happened is that we have many, many abuses after Tuskegee, at least as many after Tuskegee as beforehand. And there is not a sphere of American medicine that has gone untouched. Radiation experiments, experiments with children, reproductive abuse and experimentation. It's everywhere. Any sphere in which there's an interaction of African Americans with the system, you're going to find their abuse by the system. And in research settings, it was even more prevalent because in research settings, unlike therapeutic settings, there's a laissez-faire attitude often reigned. The interesting thing is that today we comfort ourselves that we have this matrix of laws that protect research subjects, and we do. That's a good thing. But laws are only as good as the people who enforce them and adhere to them. And all too often the laws are not being adhered to, and even more often we are passing laws now that actually erode informed consent, that reduce people's right to say yes or no in medical research. And when we do that, African Americans are often the most frequent victims of that. So unfortunately, although we do not engage in the most horrific physical abuses of the 18th and 19th centuries, we still do have many, many research studies that are ethically problematic and frankly abusive. So we still have not learned everything that we should have.
But don't you see, this way you're no better than they are. Ain't that asking a lot for us to be better than them when we get killed just trying to prove we're as good?
We're in a system of racism, white supremacy. And what makes black people have high blood pressure, stroke, kidney disease, diabetes, dying prematurely, obesity, all of these are illnesses specifically related to the hammering of 24/7 stress. Racism, white supremacy is 24/7 stress on black people.
People of color in this country are much more likely to breathe polluted air and drink polluted water. The Biden administration promises to change that, starting with an executive order the president signed this week.
With this executive order, environmental justice will be at the center of all we do, addressing the disproportionate health and environmental and economic impacts on communities of color, so-called fence line communities, especially those communities, brown, black, Native American, poor whites.
But Biden is not the first president to make such a promise. Rebecca Hersher from NPR's climate team is here with more. Good morning.
Good morning.
What did Biden do with this new executive order?
So the order creates a White House Council on Environmental Justice, so that council will suggest ways that the federal government can address the environmental impacts of systemic racism. And remember, the government helped create this situation. Discriminatory housing and zoning policies, they are the reason that people of color are more likely to live near power plants and refineries and highways, things that release a lot of pollution.
Right.
So the federal government is promising to undo some of that.
The federal government has promised such before, right? I mean, this isn't the first time a president has acknowledged the responsibility by signing an executive order. What's going to be different?
Honestly, Biden's approach is not very different from what past presidents have done. All the way back in 1994, President Clinton signed an executive order that also created a special group to work on environmental justice. But progress has been really slow since then. Overall air and water quality in the U.S. have gotten better, but the places that were most polluted in the 90s are basically the same places that are most polluted now. And that's deadly. Neighborhoods where people of color are exposed to chronic pollution, they're also the neighborhoods with some of the highest mortality rates from COVID-19 and some of the most severe damage from climate-driven disasters. So there are layers of environmental racism here, and they have not been fixed despite decades of federal promises.
So what's been the effect of that, all those unmet promises on people living in these places with a lot of pollution?
People are frustrated. When you see a lot of promises, it makes you wary of new promises. I talked to a man named Devon Hall about this. He runs a local anti-pollution group in North Carolina. Specifically, they're trying to cut down on pollution from hog farms. So the feces from the farms, it gets into the air and the water. It makes people sick. And Black people are hit the hardest.
If you look at the maps, you begin to look at where the facility is located, it's pretty much in communities of color.
So Hall has been trying to reduce this pollution for more than 20 years. Regulators have acknowledged it's a problem, acknowledged that Black people are the ones who are suffering, even said that what's happening in Hall's home county violates the Civil Rights Act. But the pollution is still happening. And I asked Hall, what would he say to the new administration? And he had some questions that he thinks people in power should really ask themselves.
How do you give a voice to the voiceless? How do you give those people a platform to voice their concerns? And then who's going to have a listening ear? And how long will you listen to those people crying out?
He says, frankly, actions speak louder than words.
Right. So is there a specific action the Biden administration could take beyond this executive order?
Yeah. So Vice President Kamala Harris sponsored an environmental justice bill when she was a senator that could give more power to people like Hall. That bill could have more life now that Democrats control the Senate. And the Biden administration is also planning to spend trillions of dollars on pandemic recovery and climate change. That means jobs, infrastructure, healthcare investments. So a lot of people are watching to see if that money is spent equitably.
Rebecca Hersher with NPR's climate team. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
But don't you see, this way you're no better than they are. Ain't that asking a lot for us to be better than them when we get killed just trying to prove we're as good?
We're in a system of racism, white supremacy. And what makes Black people have high blood pressure, stroke, kidney disease, diabetes, dying prematurely, obesity, all of these are illnesses specifically related to the hammering of 24/7 stress. Racism, white supremacy is 24/7 stress on Black people.
The most valuable takeaway for students is to understand that they are the people with the least power and the most to lose by implicitly or explicitly criticizing the system, criticizing their professors, criticizing the way medicine is performed. And yet it's absolutely critical that they have the courage to speak up if they think they see something wrong. There are several reasons for that. One reason is that medical students have, in my opinion, a privileged perspective. They're still not completely socialized as doctors. So they still are able to see things from a layperson's point of view. And frankly, most doctors lose that eventually. It's part of the training. And it's nothing wrong with that. I mean, you're socialized into a profession and you gain, frankly, so much more. But as medical students, you still have both worlds. You're training as a physician, you have that perspective, but you can still see things from a layperson's perspective. Sometimes only you can see that something is wrong. Sometimes only you can be sensitive enough to understand that something can be abusive. And it's critically important to speak up, even though it's risky, even though it might cost you something, because you may be the only one seeing this wrong, and you may even be successful. You may even convince your attendings, your superiors, your colleagues that they need to reevaluate a practice or reevaluate a stance. So in that way, you can, and students have been, extremely important in advancing ethical thinking in medicine. I'm thinking, for example, of a group of London students. When I was studying medical ethics, in London, there were a few students who were being asked to do, as students had been asked to do for decades before them, you're going to learn to do a pelvic examination by practicing on this unconscious woman. She's been prepped for another surgery. She's unconscious. Now's your chance. Learn how to do a pelvic. And some students said, no, I don't want to do this. She hasn't given her permission. She's not awake, which means if I don't know what I'm doing, should I hurt her, she can't even tell me. It's wrong. They convinced their attending, they convinced people in their hospital. That hospital stopped allowing this practice. Other hospitals fell in suit, and in this country, some hospitals also no longer allow this. So their vision actually changed the practice of medicine, and that's the most important thing I have to say to medical students.
But don't you see, this way you're no better than they are. Ain't that asking a lot for us to be better than them when we get killed just trying to prove we're as good?
We're in a system of racism, white supremacy. And what makes black people have high blood pressure, stroke, kidney disease, diabetes, dying prematurely, obesity, all of these are illnesses specifically related to the hammering of 24/7 stress. Racism, white supremacy is 24/7 stress on black people.
I had hoped when I wrote this book that it would inspire other people, especially historians of medicine, to write about some of the issues that I addressed. I hoped, it had been my dream, that this would actually be viewed as a new, become a new canon in the history of medicine, that people would explore this history. And I've seen that happen. There's now been a book published on I did a chapter on the fate of African Americans immediately around the time of the Civil War. And there's been a book published on that very subject. I did a section of the book where I talked about the government's propensity for supporting psychiatrists who are looking into a connection between violence and race. And Jonathan Metzl, wrote a book, The Protest Psychosis, that deals exactly with that. So I'm seeing more and more. Very recently, the New York Times has started a brilliant new series, 1619, to commemorate the 400 years since Africans first set foot on the continent. And in this series, the first session of the series, I'm reading it, and I felt like I was reading my book. The story of John Brown, which I tell in my book, is there. The story about the vaccination by Onesimus. All these things I had written in my book 12 years earlier are now in the New York Times, and everyone's reading them. And that's made me very happy. That's what I want to see. I want to see more and more people delve into this history, and more importantly, what this history can tell us about what's going on today. How we can interpret events today in the light of our history to understand and hopefully not repeat the mechanisms that bring them to bear.
You wake up one morning with a dry, hacking cough, and you've lost your sense of smell. You visit your doctor for a diagnosis. With an X-ray and nasal swab, she diagnoses COVID. The coronavirus infected your body, and your lungs and nerves are now inflamed.
The inflammation sends you to hospital, and when you're in the ICU, you look around and notice a disproportionate number of people of color. In the United States, hospitalization and death rates for people of color are far higher than for white people. You make another kind of diagnosis yourself. This, you observe, is the outcome of structural racism. But how did those structures come to be?
To understand that, we must go back 600 years to a time when a different pestilence spread across the globe, one that continues today and which still makes us sick. And it makes us sick in a patterned way, through inflammatory disease, which underlies all the leading causes of death in industrialized places.
European colonization transformed the planet. Through slavery, genocide, and disease, colonists brought with them a cosmology that changed how people relate to each other and to the living world around them. Those who resisted were set to the flame.
This history lives inside you, whether you know it or not. Since you were conceived, your body has been exposed to the consequences of a world on fire.
The COVID hospital ward and the specific patients who are in its beds look that way because of centuries of attempts to extinguish other kinds of knowledge and civilizations.
If we understand disease with this new kind of diagnosis, the treatment options become radically different. The deep medicine we prescribe to address the inflammation of people and planet has been prescribed by others before us.
Rudolf von Virchow and Sitting Bull and Frantz Fanon.
Huda Sha'arwi and B.R. Ambedkar and Harriet Tubman.
They understood that our modern ills can't simply be vaccinated away.
We need a world rebuilt with care at its heart.
But what does that look like? Many indigenous communities have resisted colonialism by continuing to care for the living world around them. Their care for life protects them inside and out.
Indigenous communities defend the greatest range of biodiversity on the planet and, as a result, host the most diverse microbiota inside their bodies. These microbes confer protection against inflammatory disease.
When culture isn't capitalist and isn't colonized, it can soothe the inflammatory diseases that afflict us and fuel the burning of our planet.
Deep medicine offers new and old stories that connect humans to the teeming microbes in our guts and to the teeming stars in the skies. We offer a glimpse into cosmologies that bring a cooling balm
to a world, to societies, and to bodies that are inflamed.
But don't you see, this way you're no better than they are.
Ain't that asking a lot for us to be better than them when we get killed just trying to prove we're as good?
We're in a system of racism, white supremacy. And what makes black people have high blood pressure, stroke, kidney disease, diabetes, dying prematurely, obesity, all of these are illnesses specifically related to the hammering of 24/7 stress. Racism, white supremacy is on 24/7 stress.
Our system is racist, and we're all participants in the system. I had a black woman come in with back pain who every time she coughed, she would get chest pain, and she was just there with back pain. She would cough, she's like, oh, my chest, and she had a very histrionic personality. And so all the providers were inclined to just be like, oh, okay, let's just give her some cough medicine, So one day I was like, let me put an EKG on you, because I think the New England Journal study just came out that black women have the worst health outcomes with heart attacks because they're not listened to. So I'm like, okay, let me just try this. So I put an EKG on her, and every time she coughed, she had ST elevation. She was having a heart attack. I said, oh my God. So I called the cardiologist and I said, can you please cath this lady? Because I think she has a bridge artery going through her, myocardium, so that when her intrathoracic pressure is increased, it's collapsing the artery and she's having cardiac issues. And he said, well, send her to my outpatient clinic. I said, this woman will never show up to your outpatient clinic. I know this woman, I've known her for 5 years, she will never show up. She's here in the hospital, she's gonna be here for a couple of days with back pain, let's just do a cath. And he refused to do the cath. And so finally I said, I don't want this woman to become a statistic that black women get worse medical care around heart attacks than everybody else because the medical institution doesn't listen to them. And he said, are you calling me a racist? And I said, well, I think our system is racist, and we're all participants in the system, and I'm trying to check myself. And I had to check myself and actually go, she's saying chest pain, get an EKG. Like, that's what you're trained to do. Why wasn't I doing it, right? And so I think a part of it is just starting to unlearn our own implicit biases that we've been raised with in this society, and challenge yourself with each patient encounter. Now I just challenge myself when I'm looking at Black, Indigenous, Latino person, I challenge myself, okay, what am I not seeing? What am I not asking? Because I'm a part of this system. And through that own self-inquiry and examination, I also now start, talking with my colleagues. Look what I missed.
But don't you see, this way you're no better than they are.
Ain't that asking a lot for us to be better than them when we get killed just trying to prove we're as good?
We're in a system of racism, white supremacy. And what makes black people have high blood pressure, stroke, kidney disease, diabetes, dying prematurely, obesity, all of these are illnesses specifically related to the hammering of 24/7 stress. Racism, white supremacy is 24/7 stress on black people.
Since I wrote Medical Apartheid, I've written several other books, and one of them had to do with the pharmaceutical industry and its commercialization of medicine and medical research. But I've been focusing more lately on cognitive effects of medical, injuries. I wrote a book called Infectious Madness, where I talked about pathogens and their role in mental disease. And a very recently published book is about environmental toxicity, environmental racism, and its cognitive effects. I mean, we all know that lead causes brain damage. We all know that heavy metals like mercury and arsenic also do that. But I write about the fact that pathogens, pesticides, even banned pesticides, and PCBs and industrial chemicals all take their toll on human minds. And environmental racism means that they're taking a greater toll on people of color than they are on whites, and all that means. So I started by talking about intelligence, IQ testing, what it really means, what it really tests, and then I go on to explain and document how exposure to all these noxious chemicals and pathogens is affecting our intelligence, our collective intelligence, but is disproportionately victimizing African Americans. So that's my current obsession.
But don't you see, this way you are no better than they are. Ain't that asking a lot for us to be better than them when we get killed just trying to prove we're as good?
We're in a system of racism, white supremacy. And what makes black people have high blood pressure, stroke, kidney disease, diabetes, dying prematurely, obesity, all of these are illnesses specifically related to the hammering of 24/7 stress. Racism, white supremacy is 24/7 stress on black people.
Some folks in North Carolina claim a food company is dumping waste right on their doorsteps. Hundreds have gone to court to make it stop. Mark Strassman paid a visit to see and smell for himself.
I want to sit out on the front porch today, but I can't because of the spray.
In this cell phone video, Renee Miller recorded. The farm across the street from her lifelong home in Warsaw, North Carolina, is spraying hog waste. The slightest breeze blows it into her yard and over her home and car.
You walk inside, are you wet?
Just like I sweat.
But it's not sweat.
Right.
It sounds disgusting.
It is disgusting.
North Carolina's 2,000 hog farms pump waste into storage lagoons. Overflow is sprayed onto fields as fertilizer, but sometimes, according to residents, the sprayers miss their marks, hitting homes nearby.
I've never had a complaint from any of my neighbors. We try to do what is right.
12 miles away, Jeff Spedding farms for Smithfield Foods, the world's largest pork producer and supplier. He says farmers want to be good neighbors, but he sees no better way to get rid of the waste.
But it gets into what's cost effective also. It also gets into what's reasonable. There isn't any technology that's more efficient than what we're doing.
Hog farms and their waste are regulated by North Carolina's Department of Environmental Quality, or DEQ. In annual inspections, the agency monitors where and how often farms spray.
Just to be clear, the people were there first.
The people were here first. That's such an important point.
Rick Dove works for the environmental advocacy group Waterkeeper Alliance. They filed a complaint against DEQ alleging environmental racism by allowing farms to locate disproportionately near minority communities. The EPA is investigating the environmental justice claims, and DEQ says it's cooperating.
Nobody's trying to put this industry out of business, just out of the pollution business.
In a statement, the North Carolina Pork Council called those claims wildly exaggerated. It added, "We strongly reject any charge that race plays any part in the location or operation of hog farms."
When those sprayers are going, this house takes a direct hit.
Takes a direct hit, yes.
Renee Miller and more than 500 residents have filed civil suits against Smithfield's pork division, claiming the farms are making it impossible for them to enjoy their homes.
I'm stuck. And I always say I'll probably die here stuck.
While the civil suits play out in court, Miller dreads the summer. She says it's the busy season for the sprayer across the road.
Who wants to live like this?
Mark Strassman, CBS News, Warsaw, North Carolina.
But don't you see, this way you're no better than they are. Ain't that asking a lot for us to be better than them when we get killed just trying to prove we're as good?
We're in a system of racism, white supremacy. And what makes black people have high blood pressure, stroke, kidney disease, diabetes, dying prematurely, obesity, all of these are illnesses specifically related to the hammering of 24/7 stress. Racism, white supremacy is 24/7 stress on black people.
We are sick and tired of being sick and tired.
Today it's time to stop singing and start swinging.
We're coming to get our check.
You are now listening to P.A.R. That's People Activity Radio. And I'm your host, Don G. Horse. Welcome. You have found your family
You take me for a walk
in a peaceful place.
under the sycamore tree, the dark trees that blow, baby, in the dark trees that blow.
Sang to him, little Jimmy Scott. Where you gonna see him, Jimmy? Are we gonna see you too?
And I'll see you in the branches that blow.
Yes, sir. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. P.A.R. is a family-friendly information distribution program seeking to inform non-white people, in particular black classified, and assist them in counter-racist codification. The title of today's episode is The Co-ed Prison of Black Classification, Episode 3, Medical Apartheid and the Pre-Existing Condition of Blackness. One more time, The Co-ed Prison of Black Classification, Episode 3, Medical Apartheid and the Pre-Existing Condition of Blackness. Sang to him, Jimmy.
And you'll see me, and I'll see you in the branches that blow.
You are now listening to P.A.R. That's People Activity Radio, hosted by John G. Horse, a blue-collar commentary radio podcast attempting to remove confusion in everyday social events. If you are subject to non-white classification, in particular black classified, welcome. You have found your family in a peaceful place. People Activity Radio can be found at peopleactivityradio.com. That's peopleactivityradio.com. On Twitter at John G. Horse. On Instagram at j.g.horse. On our YouTube channel titled People Activity Radio. On SoundCloud channel titled People Activity Radio. Our Tumblr page titled People Activity Radio. On Spotify titled People Activity Radio. Apple Podcast, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, and all other podcast platforms. If you find this information constructive, please subscribe, like, and share.
If you find this information remotely constructive, please subscribe, like, and share. And I got to apologize in advance, family.
You know how we do, Lil Jimmy Scott. Young folk, do you go.
Yes, indeed.
Under the sycamore tree.
Take your time, Lil Jimmy. Take your time.
The dark trees that blow, baby. In the dark trees that blow.
Bring us to that bridge.
And I'll see you, and you'll see me, and I'll see you in the branches that blow in the breeze.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. And this is P.A.R. People Activity Radio. And I am your gracious and humble host, John G. Horse. Welcome. You have found your family in a peaceful place. And let me repeat the title of today's episode one more time. The title of today's episode is The Co-Ed Prison of Black Classification, Episode 3. Medical apartheid and the pre-existing condition of blackness. Where should we begin? Where should we begin? Is always the question. So we're going to get right into it, family. And I got to take this time right now, family, to show appreciation for all of the listeners who have contributed to old John G's Cash App. It is much appreciated, and all resources, pennies, nickels, and dimes, are directly used for making the show consistent and competitive for your listening pleasure. And always, we keep it constructive. Let's move on.
John G. Horse's Cash App is $JOHN, capital G, capital H, O-R-S-E.
So the first clip that was played was a clip of a movie titled No Way Out, starring Sidney Poitier, the great Sidney Poitier. Yes, indeed. Talent is talent. Recognize it. You understand me? Man's working under the full onslaught of racism, white supremacy, with high levels of melanin up in his pigmentation. That being said, the movie is titled No Way Out, starring Sidney Poitier, and the clip was a clip of Dr. Poitier. I forget his screen name, but we're going to say Dr. Poitier speaking to a blue-collar worker, an elevator operator named Lefty. And Lefty was expressing his desire, his will to practice counter-racist violence. Now, the context of this conversation is the talented Dr. Poitier was operating on a person who classified themselves as white, and the person passed away from pre-existing conditions. But the family member of the person who passed away, who classified themselves as white, also classified as white, accused Dr. Talented 10th Sidney Poitier, Dr. Poitier, of murdering his family member because he was black and incompetent. The movie is full of white codes and what it means to be white, and all victims under the system of racism, white supremacy are equal. That's either true or it's not true. That being said, Sidney Poitier, or Dr. Poitier, was getting on the elevator, and Lefty, the elevator operator on the clip that I played earlier, was getting off shift early because he was leading a counter-racist, violent attack. In his words, as you heard on the clip, I'm gonna get me some tonight. Now, Sidney Poitier, Dr. Poitier, took the position of, hey, look here. If you go out there and strike first, you know better than them. And the mic drop statement was, and he's looking at Dr. Poitier, who's a doctor who was being mistreated, being hit with all types of racial epithets and racial slurs as he's trying to operate on a suspected white supremacist, while the suspected white supremacist family member is sitting up in there, all sabotaging every move he make, looking crazy, looking silly, looking as if he is an imbecile. He looks at Dr. Poitier, the nerve. We gotta show that we better than them by all the time, by the whole while we getting killed by just trying to be as good. My translation, hell, we just want justice. We ain't trying to prove nothing. I don't wake up in the morning trying to prove to nobody that I'm better than anybody. Let's move on. So Lefty Left Work got covered by a colleague who took on his duties that night, and he went in and put in that work. Now, I'd like to take this time to say VGQ to Dr. Poitier and VGQ to Lefty. You have the right to respond to your victim status any way you see fit. Let's move on. The following clip was a trailer that was being played, which was highlighting the life and contributions to this society in these United States of America, and it was highlighting a gentleman by the name of Edward Bernays. Edward Bernays, known as the father of United States propaganda in engineering consent. Yes, indeed, public relations. Listen to the words: propaganda, public relations, engineering consent. Edward Bernays family. Do your Googles. Let's move on. The following clip was a Noam Chomsky's inspired clip, in which was highlighting the 5 filters of mass media. The 5 filters of mass media. If you don't go along with the program, you are going to be discredited. You are going to be mistreated. You are going to lose access. You are not going to succeed in this society. So instead of knocking you over the head with clubs, shooting up the club, and pounding y'all into concentration camps, we just produce information. We produce propaganda. And when I say we, I'm talking about the dominant society. And if you don't go along with the lie, if you don't go along with the myth, well, you're going to get that there thing called mistreatment in all areas of people activity. Do your Googles. 5 filters of mass media. Let's move on. Now, after that clip, I played an interview of our sweet queen mother, author of the world-renowned, and I say the world-renowned because this particular book that our sweet queen mother, Harriet A. Washington, wrote, spent her life energy producing, is called Medical Apartheid: The Dark History of Medical Experimentation on Black Americans from Colonial Times to the Present. One more time, our sweet queen mother is Harriet A. Washington. And I will say that this book, this literature, is must-have material in all homes of non-white people, in particular people subject to black classification. And it is something that rings true today. Medical Apartheid: The Dark History of Medical Experimentation on Black Americans from Colonial Times to the Present. Because our sweet queen mother said she was inspired to write this book. Harriet A. Washington was inspired to write this book because she was in the medical industry, and anytime anybody subject to non-white, in particular black classification, had any questions about any treatment, any perceived mistreatment or non-justice that was going on up in the industry of the healthcare industry, she said that it was always dismissed as an overreaction to, quote unquote, the Tuskegee experiment. Now, family, if you don't know nothing about the Tuskegee experiment, this isn't a show trying to highlight the Tuskegee experiment. So do your Google. Sometimes you're just going to have to do your research on your own, family, because everything is not going to be handed to you. You understand me? That is why you have to practice united, independent, compensatory. Compensatory means you got to, something has to be compensated for. And we suffer from not only mistreatment in all areas of people activity, we also suffer from lack of information. Lack of information, misinformation, and that leads to confusion. You understand me? So Sweet Queen Mother Harriet A. Washington said that nothing could be further from the truth. Talking about some Tuskegee. Man, it was so many atrocities, far worse than the Tuskegee experiment before and after. And not understanding our relationship with healthcare, with the medical industry, as it pertains to our black classification and the long legacy of mistreatment, is actually contributing to misinformed consent in all areas of the medical industry. Not only that, you sitting up in a society that is based and anchored in its systematic anti-blackness and or white racism, white supremacy, and as Dr. Kamal Kambone calls it, white terror domination. And you have physicians trained in that same toxic environment. They are learning how to mistreat those of us who find ourselves subject to black classification. We go to the doctor to be treated because we are suffering from ailments, and we get to the hospital, we get to the medical center, and we sitting up in a hot, sweltering pot of systematic anti-blackness, white terror domination, racism, white supremacy. You understand me? And like our sweet Queen Mother, Dr. Frances Cress Welsing said, our grandsister, Dr. Frances Cress Welsing said, black folks are suffering from racism, white supremacy, which feeds all the other conditions that we are leading in. Hypertension, high blood pressure, diabetes. We can go on and on. Cancer. We can go on and on with a beat behind it and put some rhymes to it, and it's the same old song, same old story. Where is and never you find people subject to black classification on the planet. You understand me? And that is the result of a system that's working just fine. The system of racism, white supremacy, the system of anti-blackness and or, as Dr. Kamal Kambone calls it, white terror domination. Let's move on. I thought I'd throw in the clip that never gets old, and if you have any type of codification, you can understand how the story was reported, and it is a 2014 UNICEF report that I found on NPR. Do your Googles, family. And the report says by 2050, the majority of the planet's population would be African. Now, I got kind of confused because what the heck does that word African mean? I think that term, and I could be in error, means the majority of the world's population will be subject to black classification. And the way that they reported the report was as if that was a problem. Now, family, this when counter-racist codification comes into play. Now, when you hear information like that, and the tone that was taken was a sad tone, why is that a sad tone if you are subject to black classification? Now, when you hear them reporting on good birth weights and healthy white people, the tone isn't sad. And what are we gonna do about this? The tone is happy. You understand me? The tone is positive. But when you get this 2015 report, and they talk about some, oh my goodness, the majority of the population by 2015, I'm sorry family, the the UNICEF report of 2014. And when they report that the majority of the population is going to, in 2050, is going to be people subject to black classification and, or as they say it, African. And I have to figure out what that word means. It's very confusing. But the majority of the population is going to be African. And everybody's sad and like they singing the blues and they lip poked out like they lost their dog and all that. Wait a minute. That was an extremely positive report. I mean, we get all this negative news. Hey, I'm not gonna lie, folk, I almost wanted to cut a jig. That being said, I didn't cut the jig. For all you frigid codification followers, you understand me. Let's move on. And if anybody wants to know the show that our sweet queen mother, our grandsire, Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, was being interviewed on, she was being interviewed on the Karen Hunter show. And you can find her show via podcast and or YouTube clips. And our sweet queen mother was putting down some extremely constructive information and codification on that show and any other show that you find sweet queen mother, Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, on. That being said, let's move on. The following clip was a clip on NPR about pandemics, epidemics. They were comparing the 1918 Spanish flu to the 2020 coronavirus, COVID-19, and they said the same thing back then it was happening as it pertains to those who are subject to non-white classification, in particular those who are subject to black classification being the most affected. Now, family, we suffer from a precondition of black classification, and this precondition of black classification has us sick every which way but loose. You understand me? Mental health problems, physical health problems, spiritual problems, intellectual problems, all types of problems that we don't even have words from. Our bodies historically react to the trauma that we face 24/7, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, non-stop pummeling of systematic anti-blackness on our next day in, day out. You're not gonna respond positively to the trauma, family. That is why we have all types of illness. We are not in good mental health. We are not in good physical health. We all need to be treated, you understand me? Not mistreated, just treated for the trauma. Hell, in most of our environments, we can't even openly talk about our engagement, our trauma at the workplace. We can't go to our family and talk about racism, white supremacy, because most of our family members don't even want to talk about racism, white supremacy. They want you to hush that fuss. They want to party, eat them ribs, drink they drink, and listen to their music. You understand me? They don't want to talk about racism, white supremacy when they're not at work dealing with racism, white supremacy. So we ignore the issue. The issue is not diagnosed. And if the issue is not diagnosed, it's not recognized. And if it's not recognized, you're not able to work through your trauma. Matter of fact, it's not even no post-traumatic situation, as our queen mother, Dr. Joy DeGruy says. It's ongoing still to this day. So we're just going through perpetual traumatic syndrome, PTS. You understand me? The clip following that was a clip on NPR speaking on the subject matter of environmental racism. Now, our elder, Neely Fuller Jr., says racism is white supremacy. And we have concluded here on People Activity Radio that racism is war against non-white people, in particular people subject to black classification. That being said, when you put the word racism behind environmental, what you're saying is the environment is manipulated by those people who classify themselves as white, and it is manipulated in a fashion to where it is mistreating those of us who are classified as black. Now, this particular report was talking about environmental racism as it pertains to hog farms in North Carolina. Hog farms which uses water to fertilize their grass, their farms. Now, fertilizing their grass on their farms with water from reservoirs which they have on the farms, where they store the excrement of hogs in the reservoirs. Now, they use the excrement of the hogs. They put the excrement of the hogs inside the reservoirs, and then they use the water from the reservoirs to spray their land and fertilize it. You understand me? Now, most of these hog farms are located near, guess where? Communities which have high levels, a high population of people subject to non-white classification, in particular, people subject to black classification, and the stench and the smell, and Lord knows what type of toxins that you find in the air and in the environment in this area. And in particular, there was one report of a woman classified as black, clearly had just got off of work when the reporters got over there. So she is a hard-working, law-abiding citizen who practices blue-collar John Henryism. She practiced blue-collar John Henryism. She deals with people who classify themselves as white all day at work. She gets off of work, and she has to be fearful and stressful of whether the farmers across the street who classify themselves as white and we believe practice the religion of racism, white supremacy, which she has to be fearful and stressful and have all type of anxieties about, are they spraying today? Will I be able to get out of my car and go into my house without getting sprayed with boo-boo water? Blue collar, law-abiding citizen, John Henryism practitioner. You understand me? Talking to politicians, talking to all type of activists. Everybody is saying that, yeah, this is environmental racism, but ain't nothing being done. You understand me? That is the system of racism, white supremacy, family. All sectors of the system work together. The judges, the politicians, the law enforcement. You understand me? The code enforcers. Ain't nobody enforcing nothing but the maintenance of the system of racism, white supremacy. That's either true or it's not true, family. And one of the final clips that was played was a clip promoting the book authored by Dr. Rupa Marya. And the book is entitled Inflamed. And Dr. Rupa Marya, who is a person, a non-white woman, lots, high-level melanin, non-white woman, but I believe she would be ethnically Asian. Which Asian ethnicity, I couldn't tell you, but she is very highly melanated, and if you're watching on the YouTube clips, you can see how she looks. But Dr. Rupa Mayra breaks down the effects of colonialism, racism, white supremacy, slavery, and how our bodies, our physical makeups, our spiritual health, our mental health, all results from our history. And if you find yourself subject to that thing called black classification or non-white classification, you do not, your bodies, your physical and mental health are not responding positively to this environment. If you want to treat everybody for these ailments and all these pre-existing conditions that are found in so-called indigenous, non-white, and black communities, we might want to treat the people, we might want to correct the environment. This is her words, not mine, and I'm paraphrasing. We might want to address the system of racism, white supremacy, and treat everybody instead of poking everybody with so-called vaccinations, because it ain't working. As you can see, every year the vaccination has to be changed because viruses mutate and evolve, etc., etc. I'm not a doctor. I'm not going to get into all that stuff that I don't understand, but I do understand that if you had in good mental health, if you're in good physical health, if you're in good spiritual health, that affects your immune system positively, and your immune system 9 times out of 10 can put up a good fight. By no means am I an expert on this particular subject, but just like all of you family, nothing's stopping me from finding literature to get me more informed on this situation. We are in a situation, family, as non-white people and people subject to black classification, where we are subject to what is in ever the dominant society wants to do. We're in a perpetual state of misinformation, so we don't know whether we should go and get a vaccine. We don't know if we should hold back because we understand the legacy and history of the dominant society as it pertains to misinformation, propaganda, and manufacturing consent. And those of us who are subject to black classification, if we have this book, Medical Apartheid, and we know the long legacy of treacherous, evil mistreatment upon non-white people, in particular people subject to black classification in the medical industry, in the healthcare industry, we would be most apprehensive about running to clinics. But at this state, with this onslaught of this propaganda, man, I'll admit, family, I don't know what to do. You understand me? And I'm not gonna get into what you should do and what you shouldn't do, but this is the code. Replace the system of racism, white supremacy with a system of justice, and you won't be so doggone confused. That's either true or it's not true. And I hope I have contributed to less confusion. And always remember, keep learning and stay codified.
John G. Horse's Cash App is $JOHN, capital G, capital H, O, R, S, E.
The dark trees that blow, baby, in the dark trees that blow, and I'll see you, and you'll see me, and I'll see you in the branches that blow in the
economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war.
If you do not understand racism, which is white supremacy, what it is and how it works, everything else that you understand will only confuse you. Confuse you. Confuse you. Confuse you. Confuse you. If you do not understand, confuse you. If you do not understand, confuse you. If you do not understand, confuse you. Confuse you.
My definition of white supremacy and racism, I use those two terms as synonyms. I use the same definition for both terms. That definition is as follows: a global system of people who classify themselves as white and are dedicated to abusing and or subjugating everyone in the known universe whom they classify as not white.
Economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war.